Husic, thanks very much for your time.
Hi, Tom.
Just want to start on the NBN announcement. I know this is your old area, if you like, broadly, in a digital sense, for the digital economy. This announcement from NBN, there's going to be discounts on wholesale prices, but still the CVC charge remains and is as is. What have you made of that?
Well, obviously we want to be able to go through the detail of that and determine if this is meaningful change. It's not an easy area to move on because it will change in many respects the business case around NBN.
And the budget.
And the budget. And so, we'll also take on board comments from the sector as well about how it goes. But this is, this problem has been a long time in the making in the way that the government has managed the entire process since coming to office. The changes that Malcolm Turnbull made and the cost blowouts as a result of going for complicated technology options like HFC or cable broadband that required a lot of money to give effect to, and changes in the back-end IT systems. And what I see on the ground in my part of Western Sydney, where people are still waiting, being told that they'll get NBN rolling to their front door at a particular date, and then that date is missed and another date is flagged and that doesn't happen. So the dissatisfaction in the mind of the public that have to experience this is big, and they'll probably be wondering whether or not this makes much difference to them.
And so there are still a lot of stories about issues with the NBN, but in the lead up to the last election, there wasn't a lot to differentiate Labor and the government's policies because the rollout was so far advanced. Where do you go from here? Would you look at a big budget write-down to improve the experience of consumers? Should that be a real consideration?
I am not going to race to make a judgment call on that straight after an election, because that does require big calls to be made on the financing. And, the opportunity for us to make a big break in terms of policy was in 2016, because you had, at least at that point, a chance to change the way the rollout was being done.
As in the lead up to that election?
Yeah. And, once Malcolm Turnbull got back in, and given how far this would sort of progress over that course of time, it makes it a bit more difficult to change. But there will, I think, longer term, be a big challenge. And the challenge is this: in places that didn't get fibre rolled out into their neighbourhoods and they're relying on cable broadband, the experience that they get on that system, and whether or not you can then go back in and replace it longer term, and how much that'll cost, because there will be a lot of people that are not getting broadband that have been promised, much faster broadband, much more reliable, and that's going to be, the lived experience.
Yeah, so maybe it's a bit two-tiered for now. We'll see if Labor might be willing to stump up cash on that. What about climate change policy? Because there are already colleagues speaking out about this, about whether or not you should still have this more ambitious policy than the coalition. What's your view on where Labor should go?
Personally, I think, given how serious this issue is, given that scientists have said we've got about 12 years of opportunity to take action, and then it'll be too late in terms of the damage to the climate being very difficult to address. I think ambition in this space is better than no ambition. I think putting in more effort to ensure that we're generating cleaner, more efficient forms of energy is important. Getting other sectors to change the way that they act and to reduce the impact on the environment is very important. Some economies, Tom, like for example in the UK, Germany, are thinking long term about what they do in terms of the generation of energy, their reliance on coal, and the way that they change sector impacts. So I think, frankly, we do have to have a much more ambitious approach than what we're getting out of the government. I don't think business as usual out of them is going to cut it. And if other governments have been able to see fit to plan longer term about what has to happen to their economies, I think Australia should and can do the same.
So there's planning longer term, but you also spoke about this 12-year sort of deadline that some people are putting on this. So does that mean you need a meaningful target still in that year 2030 and not push that out, as some have said?
Well, the difficulty in terms of the 2030 target, it's similar to what we were talking about a few moments ago with broadband. You have one point of time, if you change a government, you can then change direction and have time to do so meaningfully. With us not being successful in May means you're talking about 2022 potentially being elected and only having 8 years to give effect to what you want to do.
So you think that 45% overall target might be too hard to achieve too quickly, because it would start.
That is one concern that has been expressed, right? And I think people are looking longer term at what we do for 2050 and whether we have, net zero emissions and what gets done there. I think we do need to think that through. You're seeing in the course of the US presidential election a number of candidates, be it Elizabeth Warren through to Bernie Sanders, bringing out some fairly strong, ambitious policies economy-wide to help deal with emissions, to help deal with people whose jobs would be affected by change as well, having substantive reform packages in place to help people retrain and move to new work that might be affected. And none of this thinking really is being done by this government. All they're doing is politicking.
Was there enough detail in the Labor's policy before the last election on that?
Well, we did put a lot of detail. We did two things. We set out a target and we also set out our determination to work with industry and unions to ensure that just transition occurred. There was a lot of thinking that was done principally by Mark Butler on this. I think it's been very big of him in the last week to say that all our elections, as they are going to review, we need to have a hard look at what we're doing. But I have to say, the thinking that Mark has done in this space, and even if you just spend time looking at, for example, the work that he's authored in Climate Wars, the deep level of thought that has been applied in this space by our side of politics and principally Mark has meant that we are in a strong position to think longer term about what to do. But as I said, if you have a choice, you've got a window in which to make an impact. You have a choice about what to do. We can't get to some point down the track and say, oh, we should have been more ambitious, because that's just not going to cut it. We would have lost a lot of time. So I do think that, in this space, without, me just plucking a number out of the air, Tom,
right.
I do think, we should, as a nation, think more ambitiously about dealing with this and making a contribution, which, when you look at our neighbours, sorry to interrupt you, but if you look at what our neighbours are saying, they're saying in the Pacific, we need to do more, and I think a lot of people agree with that proposition.
You mentioned before net zero by 2050, but there need to be other considerations within that. But do you think that's a realistic target from everything you know about
as I said, flagged in our conversation, a lot of countries are thinking about what they can do in terms of big moves in this area. I mentioned some earlier. I mentioned that this won't go away in the US context as well, where they recognise they need to do more. This is, and again, it's not just in terms of energy generation, but it's the contribution to emissions from other sectors, be it transport or agriculture, how we tackle that. We can't have a situation where we're held hostage to the coalition party room as opposed to undertaking reform.
And so on that, is there a danger? There's a lot of talk about whether Labor needs to shift to the right on this in the wake of the election result. Is there also a danger that if you compromise too much, the only party seen as really serious on climate change is the Greens?
No, it's not, from my point of view, an issue of going left or right on this.
Even more or less ambitious then?
I think that it is a case...
If you don't set much of a target, anyone concerned about this will start to consider voting for the Greens. Is that a danger?
No, I don't look at it that way. I look at it as what our responsibility is as people who champion policy in the public space, to put forward policy that will have an impact, that takes into account that there will be legitimate concerns about what it'll mean to them if we do certain things to ensure that we reduce emissions, and to have a very thought-through proposition that looks after people. And I think, I think the Australian public take this issue seriously. They expect major political parties to do the same, and certainly our side of politics does, but the other side that are in government won't take this seriously. And even if last week we had senior ministers questioning whether or not humans had an impact on climate change, it goes to show you whether or not it will be taken seriously.
OK. I've only got 20 seconds or so left. Can I just get your view if you're open to this family law court review process? Will Labor look at this?
We've got to go through what's being said, but this is a very tortured and problematic area to make some sort of quick, swift move on. So we'll wait and see.
OK. Ed Husic, you were even briefer than I needed to be. Thank you.
You told me. I just work with you.
Chat soon.